Then there are nasty people who would be variously defined as the poor, the beatniks, or the generally disrespectful people who live on the wrong side of the tracks, the wrong part of the hill, or whatever it is, just the wrong town. The nice people boost and maintain their collective ego by talking about how dreadful the nasty people are. And the nasty people boost their collective ego by talking about what frightful bourgeois squares the nice people are. But they don't often realize that they have a symbiotic relationship, just like bees and flowers. Only, whereas the bee-flower relationship is harmonious, the symbiosis of different social groups is not harmonious, because each group needs the other to know who it is. If you were the only kind of people around, you wouldn't know who you were. In a totally conformist society, if the person sitting next to you is just like you, there's no point in talking to them, you might as well talk to yourself. In other words, to truly be yourself, you need others. You don't know what you mean by self unless you know what you mean by other. This is how the polarities generate everything and are absolutely essential to each other. Now, the funny thing is this: if you belong to a certain group of saved or elected people, you know you're saved because of the damn people outside. Whether this is a social salvation, spiritual salvation, or even financial salvation, you only know who you are because of your adversary, enemy, or outgroup. Once you realize this, you might start laughing because it's very funny. It's the contrast of thinking, wow, those bastards outside, and suddenly realizing that they enable you to take this pose of superiority, which you think is great. And that realization can be quite amusing. This is why society, as we know it, fears this knowledge getting out, its subversive stuff. All that Marxism, for example, is just the same thing in reverse. The collectivist idea of the state as opposed to the individualist idea of the state. But even individualists become collectivists through huge corporations. Lenin once remarked that he would love to see great corporations grow because it would make it easier for the state to take over the already established organization. Within our economy, there's a natural tendency to become collectivist, simply by progressing with its so-called free enterprise. And conversely, in a collective economy, there's a tendency for it to fall apart because it becomes boring and suppresses individual initiative. The cycle goes round and round. If you believe in a free enterprise economy, you must have an external enemy to maintain your solidarity. If there wasn't one, you'd have to invent one. Keeps everyone alert and prevents complacency. It keeps us thinking, we've got to beat those people. But in this seriousness, we lose our sense of humor. When you lose sight of the fact that it's all a game, you can become a tyrant on one extreme or a zealot on the other. To be a sane human being, you must know, right in the back of your mind, what the Germans call Hintergedank, that enemies need each other. Cops and robbers. Where would cops be without robbers? How would you know you're law-abiding if there were no criminals? It's a tricky dynamic and dangerous to explore too openly because it challenges foundational beliefs. People might misconstrue this realization and think, if evil is necessary for good, then I can do anything I want. But that attitude ruins the game. If you want to sit by yourself under a tree and not play, that's fine, so long as you don't interfere with others' games. Don't ruin it by declaring, you're all wrong. That's why such knowledge has always been considered esoteric and why, in any esoteric school, students are tested before receiving it. You can't give powerful tools or knowledge to people who lack emotional maturity, humor, or graciousness. That's the issue when young people encounter complex knowledge without being ready. They might misuse it. In today's world, it's impossible to keep such knowledge secret. Science has no secrets, and I feel no compunction discussing these ideas because others surely will. The essence of the matter is this: extremes need each other and cannot manifest without each other. The point is to keep your head when you understand that. Let's take an intermission. This morning, I focused on two key ideas: the physical universe as a system of intermeshing spectra and the interdependence of these spectra. These spectra, like the warp and woof of weaving, depend on and play with each other. I used the word physical in its original sense, meaning natural, rather than its modern interpretation as material. The material world has often been misinterpreted as stuff, inert and unintelligent, shaped only by external forces. This idea, derived from analogies like carpentry or ceramics, overlooks how true artisans interact with their medium. A good potter, for example, knows that clay has its own vitality, This interactive relationship is closer to how the world works, as opposed to the static notion of stuff. We've also been misled by the artificial separation of nouns and verbs. Language gives the impression that events, verbs, are caused by things, nouns. But in reality, many so-called things are processes. Take a fist, for example. It only exists when you clench your hand. When you open it, the fist disappears. Similarly, nature is better understood in terms of processes rather than static objects. This shift in perspective eliminates the need to ask, who started it? Because you no longer require a static thing to explain dynamic processes. The universe is not built out of static components but is instead a web of dynamic patterning. These patterns can be observed, measured, and understood as the fundamental processes of existence. So then, the other point I was making particularly was that in the spectrum you have the extremes of the spectrum, the sound and the silence, the light and the dark, space and solid. I was showing how, through the yin-yang philosophy of the Chinese, these extremes are not opposites but complements. They go together, they require each other. You understand one in terms of the other. In this way, the world isn't an opposition of light and darkness, or being and non-being, in such a way that one pole could exist alone. Neither being nor non-being can exist without the other. And so, if we have a parallel universe, you don't have to worry, as if there were something to worry about, that the play, the music of existence might cease forever. That's where the cosmology argument comes in. Now, there are two dominant theories of cosmology among physicists: the steady-state theory and the explosion theory. The steady-state proponents argue that free hydrogen in space continually coagulates, forming itself into new bodies. The explosion theorists, who currently have the edge, propose that there was an enormous concentration of energy that exploded, expelling all the galaxies outward. The whole thing, they say, is gradually dissipating radioactively until it will reach a state of quiescence. If you have a Judeo-Christian mindset that sees time as linear, you might find this unsettling because everything appears to be running down, and once it's finished, that'll be it. But I like to ask, what was it like before the Big Bang? Wasn't it probably the same as it'll be when it all peters out? In other words, whatever happened once can happen again. Given enough time or something, we might find it repeating. I don't settle for either the steady-state theory or the Big Bang theory as definitive. They're just descriptions of how it happens. The question of whether it happens again, I believe it does. I like to think of myself as a funny phenomenon. The universe is doing me this time. Maybe it'll do me again later, maybe a million years from now. Not quite the same way, but close enough to still be me. Like playing the piano, you can play the same piece, stop, and then play it again later. It's the same piece, but it's a different playing. Similarly, when the universe plays you, it plays each one of us as I. Everybody calls themselves I, and feels like they are the center of it all. But the thing about being I is you can only be one at a time. Children ask funny questions, like, who would I have been if my father had been someone else? It's odd but profound because to be anyone, you must first learn how to be someone. And yet, every someone is I. It's as if the same light shines through different holes in a black sphere. The holes are different, but the light inside is the same. Now, from a physical perspective, every organism is part of one unified pattern of behavior. You can't separate the organism from its environment. It's all one system. Take a bamboo tree. The stem is the main wiggle, the branches are sub-wiggles, and the leaves are sub-sub-wiggles. Everything wiggles in harmony, and you can't really say what's wiggling what. Is the stem wiggling the leaves, or the leaves wiggling the stem? Both arguments are equally valid. The universe is doing me, and I'm doing the universe. They're interdependent. Light wouldn't be light without eyes to see it, just as a drum won't make a sound without something to strike it. It always takes two to create anything, a relationship, an argument, or even existence itself, otherwise the garments are flowing. They don't interfere with the nature of the cloth because the cloth is woven on an erect, linear pattern. The cloth is straight like this, so, when you get a Japanese kimono, it folds up instantly for packing. But try to pack a Western man's jacket or a woman's suit jacket, and there's absolutely no way of folding the thing at all. It always comes out of your suitcase needing to go to the pressing. But you take a kimono, put it on, and it falls exactly according to its own nature. around you, and they're very dignified. You feel it, but you don't feel closed in. Now, that makes some people terribly uncomfortable. If they don't feel pinched and pulled together, they don't feel dressed. They feel like they're wearing a bathrobe. And a lot of people can't wear a bathrobe beyond a certain hour of the day because they don't feel respectable. I mean, you can perfectly well get up and put yourself into the most beautiful bathrobe you want, run around and do your work if you don't have to go to the office. Even if you had to go to the office, they ought to allow you to wear interesting robes. Furthermore, I once asked a Japanese why he didn't wear a kimono anymore, and he said, "You can't run for a bus in a kimono." Well, that's perfectly true. Unless you hoist it up and tie it into the belt, you can't. And that's rather undignified. But the thing is that in this age that is now forthcoming, when we're going to cut down the working hours because of automation, people have got to learn to saunter and dawdle. Otherwise, they'll get into mischief. So clever forms of clothing, which are supremely comfortable but which require a kind of sauntering attitude toward life, are going to be very important for the future of civilization. This pitch for the criminal market. But this is all to do with letting yourself go into the earth, into the darkness, as it were, and trusting the world that lies below you as much as you might trust the world that lies above you. Drop. Fall freely in space. That's a marvelous sensation. It's like floating. That's why people do skydiving. Because just until they pull that parachute, now the sensation of flying, even though they're dropping very fast, they get the sensation of total freedom. That's what everybody's looking for. So we get that in a way in sleep, in the arms of Morpheus. And the idea is sleep as healing. Some psychiatrists are very keen on the idea of putting their patients by hypnosis and other methods into long, long periods of sleep where they feel completely secure, looked after, with nothing to worry about. I have a favorite sleeping place. It's a house on top of the hills in Hollywood. There are great eucalyptus trees, and underneath us, there's a deck. And I like to get a sleeping bag and lie on my back under these eucalyptus trees, looking up at the stars through the shadows of leaves. It's just a marvelous feeling. Well now, we come now to this, the things of sleep, where I will say this one thing about dreaming and about Topper. We know the motto, in vino veritas, in wine, the truth comes out. Because it also has a subtle double meaning. All popular sayings have many levels of meaning. The Christian saying in vino veritas belongs to Western culture. It also means in the wine is the true blood of Christ, from the Catholic Massachusetts. That refers to the fact that life requires death, drinking blood. But in this sense, in vino veritas, the person reveals himself. Lets go of himself, lets his unconscious come out when he is drunk, or also in sleep, when the dreams come up and show the inner side of things. You will see in that way that these two states can, in a certain sense, be creative. They let things come up that are normally kept down. Because, number 3, the waking state of what we will call symbolic consciousness is highly guarded. It is the most guarded of all these states. Now, I want you to understand that the ordinary state of consciousness, what you call normal consciousness, is by no means a frank, objective awareness of the real world. Not by any means at all. It is a state of highly cultivated, hothouse-reared, special ways of perceiving the world in accordance with symbolic formulas. And it all depends on your orientation to the physical world as to what you see in it. You know, the story of a tailor who went to see the Pope. They asked him, what was he like? He said, he was a 41. Or a woman who says to a man, you saw Mrs. So-and-so today. Now, what was she wearing? He had no idea. He didn't notice. But she noticed. She didn't pay attention to what you saw because you weren't interested in looking at it. But once you got off, or whatever it be, so we notice according to what we are programmed or conditioned to notice by our social conditioning. That is to say, our upbringing, our education, our professional needs, our survival needs. So, do we notice what's happening? Now, supposing somebody from an entirely different planet came into this room and started looking at us. If they weren't programmed to notice the things we notice, they would ask the most amazing questions about what we are doing. They'd notice that most of us have standard ways of holding our hands. Why do some people hold their hands like this? Why do some sit like this? Why do others sit like that? Why don't you just let your hands hang? Very few people ever do that because they feel a funny feeling. They get that feeling like they have a couple of wet fish down there. They know what to do with them,